I am a professor, a history professor at Dickinson College. It's a small liberal arts school in South Central Pennsylvania in Carlisle. Our Knowledge for Freedom program is 2 years old. We have organized it around the framework of what we call the other Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's about the arguments over strategy between Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass about the best way to destroy slavery. Presents the tension between moderates and radicals and how they resolve it. We feel like it's a recurring theme in any movement, any fight for change, that you always have this tension, and the Lincoln-Douglas framework offers a really powerful way, I think, for our students to put all of that into context. The other thing we do at Dickinson, I run something here called the House Divided Project, which is a multimedia initiative designed to create teaching resources for K through 12 classrooms. That was pretty much how I got into the Knowledge for Freedom program. We moved from teaching teachers to now directly working with high school students. And in our multimedia efforts, we've invested a lot into building online projects. And so you'll see in a minute, that's what we're doing with the texts that we use, whether it's Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, or, we provide background that goes all the way back to Aristotle and continues all the way through to the 20th century. So let me share my screen. This is a homepage of our website, and it shows our students visiting Gettysburg Battlefield. Of course, that's one of the advantages of being in our area. We have some great field trip opportunities. This is a public-facing website with all of our curriculum available and online. So I'll take you to our text page. We feature 30 texts, mostly excerpts, and they're all sort of embedded and enhanced with multimedia resources. So let me show you the first inaugural address, since that's what I'll be demonstrating today. Each of these pages looks pretty much the same. They have a kind of epigraph at the top, a head note with some annotated introductory materials, some images, multimedia from the students. In this case, this is something that we do with all of our students. They actually build websites as part of their projects. We give them Dickinson College credit. It's a residential experience in the summer, and they do close readings of different texts. They choose, and they write essays, which they then post at their websites, and they accompany the essays with these little close reading videos. So I'll show you one from this past summer by a student named Ariana Suggs. It's a short clip from Lincoln's first inaugural that she's reading and presenting kind of Ken Burns style.
Lincoln's first inaugural, read by Ariana Suggs. Physically speaking, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. A husband and wife may be divorced and go out of the presence and beyond the reach of each other. But the different parts of our country cannot do this. They cannot but remain face to face, and intercourse, either amicable or hostile, must continue between them. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it.
Now, I think you can appreciate it's not truly Ken Burns, but she did that while she was in residence here, second week of the program, having never really worked with this platform before. I mean, most students nowadays have done some video work, but not much. And so we have a network of undergraduate tutors and graduate students who help them learn how to build out their websites and create these multimedia elements. And it's more than just multimedia skills. Obviously, you can see they learn writing and reading skills by reading aloud and learning how to articulate these texts in a way that helps capture attention, and pairing them with those images. That's all research that they do with some help and guidance, but nonetheless, it's their own. Now, sometimes in these web pages on the text, we not only provide the excerpts. In this case, it's about 700 words from Lincoln's first inaugural. The whole text of the address is about 3,600 words. But we also provide some basic discussion questions and then some curated further readings and maybe some other multimedia. This is an embedded video of me teaching the first inaugural that I did for the Gilder Lehrman Institute. So some of what we're going to cover in a few minutes is going to be captured on that video. And we have other, tools and resources here. I'm going to pull up my presentation from this link. So if you wanted to go back to it later, you could. I call this presentation, Lincoln's Secession Crisis and Ours, to try to understand what Lincoln did during his first inaugural address and how we might learn lessons from it today in our kind of current crisis. So, there's 1,001 things you could do as a historian to provide some scene setting and background on Lincoln's inaugural address. Just in case you don't remember, it was a complicated four-way race in 1860. Lincoln and the Republicans prevailed, but the Northern Democrats had split away from the Southern Democrats, and there was a kind of conservative rump caucus of old Whigs that called themselves the Constitutional Unionists. Lincoln and the Republicans won about 40% of the popular vote, but they had a clear electoral majority. Lincoln starts writing his inaugural address sometime between his election in November and his inauguration. Back then, they did it in March, but most historians think he started in January. If you look at this screen, you can see in the left lower corner here, one of the few handwritten notes we have of his opening, in compliance with a custom as old as the government, he writes. This is how Lincoln produced speeches. He liked to, do scraps of paper and little notes to himself, and he would patch them together. And then he took a pre-inaugural journey from Springfield to Washington in February of 1861 that, covered almost 100 stops. That's captured in that map next to the excerpt. And it was a chance for him to try to reassure anxious Northerners in particular that the secession crisis, which had been launched by South Carolina after his election and which was continuing through February with 7 states from the Deep South having announced that they were leaving the Union over his victory, that it was going to work out, that he was trying to be reassuring. But there's some great little stories involving kids that I could connect to this first inaugural address, so I'll just share them with you briefly if you've never heard them before. You're looking at 2 pictures at the top of Grace Bedell and Robert Todd Lincoln. So Grace Bedell is the little girl, you maybe remember this from your own school days. She was an 11-year-old in the campaign in 1860 from upstate New York. She writes Lincoln a letter, says, "Your face is so thin, you should grow whiskers." And he ends up growing whiskers between his election and inauguration. And she lived in New York, and they brought her out to meet his pre-inaugural train. And he gave her a kiss, and the reporters all covered it. He said, "I grew these whiskers for you." What you might not know is, God bless her. Just 15 years ago, we found another letter from Grace Bedell that she wrote in the middle of the Civil War, 1864. It's newly discovered. It got lost in the government archives. She says, "I've now grown to the size of a woman. I'm 14. And unfortunately, it's kind of a sad story." She says her family had fallen on hard times during the war. And she was hoping that Lincoln would give her a job as a Treasury girl. Back in the Civil War, Treasury girls were kind of like the Rosie the Riveters of the conflict. They were mostly younger, teenage single women who would copy out government documents in the era before photocopiers. We don't have a copy of Lincoln's reply. She never came to Washington, but nonetheless, it's just this little footnote to the story. An even better kind of footnote story that I think my students really appreciated was during the pre-inaugural journey, at one point, Abraham Lincoln gave his oldest son, Robert, who was a teenager about to go to Harvard, he gave him his satchel with printed copies of the inaugural address that was still in draft form. It wasn't finished, but he had several versions of it printed up. And typical teenage boy fashion, Robert lost it. He gave it to a porter, and Lincoln was furious. Angry father goes out on the railroad platform at one point to go chase down his missing satchel to get the copies of the inaugural address so they won't fall into enemy hands, or even worse, reporters' hands. Lincoln, there's a whole set of stories here I can't go into, but I think you may know Lincoln had to leave his planned journey earlier than expected because there were rumors that he was going to be assaulted in Baltimore. So he kind of snuck into Washington right after Washington's actual birthday in late February. And then he began planning for his inaugural address. Now, what I want to do is I want to focus on one little quotation first. This is something that historians like to call the non-interference pledge. I use this as a great example of close reading from the actual inaugural address that he delivered on March 4th, 1861. It's about slavery and race. And I think it really captures a learning moment for kids who are encountering documents. I have no purpose, Lincoln said, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Now, you take anybody, 50-year-old or 15-year-old, and you ask them, what does that mean? And if they just take it out of context in its own plain English, it sounds like he doesn't care about slavery. He doesn't have any moral antagonism to it. And that is the reason why we can teach our students the value of context. And by the way, the picture next to it is the Capitol building as it looked when Lincoln was inaugurated. The expanded building had an unfinished dome where the scaffolds were still visible. It's kind of like a metaphor for the unfinished nation. The way we teach close reading to our students is we tell them they have to put text into context. And in this case, the first bit of context you need is that Lincoln was quoting himself. The original version of that quote came from the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. And sometimes the students don't see that at first. But then you ask them, why would he quote himself? And you can draw out an analysis that he was trying to reassure some of his audience that nothing had been changing over the last few years, despite the crisis. But also it's important to point to the other quote that I have bolded here. This is later in the same speech in March of 1861. This is from the inaugural address, where Lincoln says explicitly, one section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. That is the only substantial dispute. Now, this does change the meaning, the potential meaning of Lincoln's first statement. He is clear throughout his career, but especially in his Republican phase, that slavery is wrong. And sometimes I think when people approach Lincoln or they teach Lincoln, they can muffle some of that. And the reason why they do that, I think, is because they sometimes confuse the difference between policies and principles. And with political speech, you have to separate them. So the principle of the Republican Party was that slavery was wrong. The policy of the Republican Party was containment, stopping its spread. The principle of the party was not that slavery is fine either way, but that we have to stop its spread. Their policy was to stop its spread so they can convince people that it was wrong and that they need to abolish it on their own voluntarily. Now, that may have been, diluted. You may argue it would never get done fast enough, but you don't want to confuse principles and policies. And Lincoln is clear in this speech that he believes, and he thinks the majority of the country believes, slavery is wrong. Now, the truth is our close reading mantra has three pillars: text, context, and subtext. And what we mean by subtext is what's missing. So, look at the text, understand the words, put them into context, but then ask yourself, what did the author leave out and why? And in this case, you may remember this. The most famous comment of all that Lincoln had made about the slavery crisis actually came before the Lincoln-Douglas debate started in 1858. It's the famous House Divided speech, where he said a house divided against itself cannot stand, and where he predicted the ultimate extinction of slavery. Now, here's the subtext for the first inaugural address. Why didn't he quote that speech? And this is what set off Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was convinced that the subtext of his decision not to reiterate the House Divided language was that Lincoln wasn't really committed to the fight against slavery, that he was beginning to back down, that he was going to conciliate the secessionists because of the crisis. And this is where you can get a really good kind of rich back and forth debate with the students over these issues. And so I wanted to show you this as a way to illustrate how we try to use different texts as a format for thinking harder about close reading. And I know everybody has their own close reading approaches, but the mantra we use in a kind of historical approach is text, context, and subtext. I happen to think that for our purposes today, in recent years, especially in this current climate of polarization and all of the angst over democracy and its future, as valuable and as important as that quotation about slavery was, this comment is more important. And that's what I wanted to finish with today and talk about, during the question and answer, if you're willing. I think this excerpt, this quotation from Lincoln's inaugural address is the most important one of all. Plainly, he said, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. And then he says, a majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. Whoever rejects it does of necessity fly to anarchy or to despotism. Unanimity is impossible. Now, the way I teach this is I ask people, clearly, Lincoln is trying to save the Union when he becomes president. But what does union mean to him? How would he define union? And usually, almost always, the answer I get first is it's the union of states. But then I point out that's the Confederate view. That's the John C. Calhoun compact view. It's a compact of states. And if I push a little harder, especially if students have had good high school teachers or they've taken AP history, they recognize that Lincoln's union is different than that. It's not about the states. It's about the government, the national government. And if you push them even harder, that's an abstraction that represents the people. It goes back to we the people. But I don't think that, that answer's fine. There's nothing wrong with that answer. That's how most people teach it. But I think we're missing something with that answer that would help us today in our crisis, which is, I don't think that gets to the precise definition of union in Lincoln's mind that this paragraph represents. What he's really defining here, when he pits it as the opposite of secession, which he says is the essence of anarchy, he says the union that holds us together is an electoral union between an electoral majority and an electoral minority, where the majority rules in a constitutional republic held in restraint by these checks and limitations. That's the only true sovereign of a free people. I think that's a powerful lesson to remind everybody about today. And there's a lot that you can do with it. Obviously, I can't cover all of it right now, but I wanted to show you one thing here that I think is very valuable that can get overlooked, and that is understanding the audience of this speech. I really believe that one of the most common misperceptions behind teaching the first inaugural is that Lincoln's audience wasn't really the seceded states. He was using them as a setup, and that he was addressing a different audience. And I try to get my students to see that. And the reason I put those fractions up there is because I think it helps them see it. Lincoln was a very mathematical minded guy. He's the only president who ever had a patent. He was kind of almost like an engineer, very precise. And you might be able to figure out those fractions from your own work or your own teaching, but 7 out of 15 represents the seceded states between Lincoln's election and his inauguration, which means that a majority of the slave states were still within the Union by the time he takes office and gives this speech. And that's his audience, those 8 out of 15 slave states, and also the divided North, those blue states that are divided between Republicans and Democrats and between Republicans and Democrats and conservative Unionists. When Lincoln originally drafted his speech, the one that Robert lost on the way to Washington, he had framed it very beautifully. He began by saying he was taking that oath in compliance with the customs of government, and he ended by saying, you have no oath to destroy this country like I do, none that's sworn in heaven. And he ends it with a question. That was the original ending of the first inaugural address. He says, in your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, rests the outcome. The question is, shall it be peace or a sword? That was hard hitting and very blunt. And what he's doing there is he's challenging the secessionists, fully aware that he's not going to reach them, but he's hoping to, compel the patriotism of everybody else in the upper South, in the border states, in the North. When he showed that to William Seward, his great rival, when he arrived in Washington, Seward panicked, and he sent him a letter and a bunch of suggestions for how to change it. And this is where we get that very famous ending of the first inaugural address, the final version, the one where he says, "I am loath to close," where he appeals to the better angels of our nature and invokes the mystic chords of memory. That's where he said, "We are not enemies, but friends." All of that language originally came from Seward, acting as an editor, telling Lincoln, "You cannot push this hard." Now, he also advised, and sometimes people forget this, he told Lincoln, "You have to make concessions. You have to make concessions, not just talk, but real policy concessions." Lincoln refused to make any concessions. I don't think the way to teach this speech is to show it as conciliation. I think it's firmness. But he did moderate the tone, because I think what he realized is maybe Seward understood his audience in some ways better than his instincts had led him to that point. Instead of threatening with that question at the end, he thought it would make more sense to couch his hard line on policy with a conciliatory tone in rhetoric as a way to try to reach those Northern Democrats, those constitutional unionists, and the remaining 8 slave states, to try to hold them in place. That's how I teach it. And I think that it helps students to see how to read texts when they're thinking about audience in that kind of way, the kind of way a politician like Lincoln would. And to draw this to a close, let me move this passage here. I have a portion of that quote paired with a different image now, and it has a whole different connotation. Of course, that's an image from January 6th. That man's name holding the Confederate flag is Kevin Seafried. I don't know if you can see clearly on your screen, but the portraits in the Capitol Rotunda behind him are none other than John C. Calhoun and Charles Sumner. And, this is, you might argue, the first time the Confederates actually invaded the Capitol building. But Seafried, by the way, is from a border state. He's from Delaware. And I don't know if anybody's following the news today, okay? But Seafried and his son both got arrested in January 6th. His son, and they've both been convicted. His son recently had his sentencing hearing, and he recanted. It's almost as if he admitted what Lincoln said was true. A majority held in restraint by checks and limitations is the only true sovereign of a free people. We shouldn't have attacked the Capitol building. He didn't quote Lincoln, but he could have. And in his statement to the judge, he admitted he was wrong, and he claimed his father had misled him, although he took responsibility for it. That's his father there. His father today, literally hours ago, just disappeared. He's missing, and the Delaware police are looking for him because he's supposed to go and face his sentencing hearing. So I imagine they'll catch him soon enough. But the reason why I think it's important that we teach this document and that we reaffirm Lincoln's creed here about the union being the union between a majority and a minority is because obviously we're living in an age when faith in that mantra, like, it's no longer a platitude, it's fraying. And obviously it's fraying with people like the Seafrieds, although I have hope, if Hunter recanted, maybe some of them can recant. We live in an area here that is Trump country. This is ultra MAGA country. One of the insurrectionists who broke into Nancy Pelosi's office and stole her laptop, she went to high school with my son. The students who come to our program, they live in and around an area that's just a modern day border state, where people are in collision with each other. And what I think I could teach them from this story about Lincoln's leadership in the crisis, about his first inaugural, is that, you have to have faith in the creed. It's not just a platitude. You have to reaffirm it and repeat it. You have to remind people that there's a process from election to inauguration that is about the peaceful transfer of power. And the reason for that is not because democracy is the Greek word for perfect, or, this is not the golden rule in the Christian faith about loving your neighbor. This is about the democratic faith. The way Lincoln would have put it, there's a logic to it. You don't have to love your neighbor, you have to live with your neighbor between elections. And it's good for all of us because we can fight and argue, and you can hate the ideas of the person that you live near or with, like the Seafrieds. But somehow, some way, if we can hold together that coalition of people who believe in democracy, then we can sustain it.